As I say, I'm Dr. Sue Onslow. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Roger Hearing, who is going to be our moderator of the discussion today. I'm the former kind of liaison officer for the work that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies has done since 2017 on challenges to media freedom across the Commonwealth. We are going to be discussing the very pressing issues around the contested Ugandan elections of January 2021, and I'm going to be have the time to be making a number of express comments about the media environment, which has been a critical element of these contested elections. So if I may, I'd like to hand over, please, to Mr. Roger Hearing.
Thanks very much indeed, Sue. And yes, a warm welcome to neither free nor fair. There's a question mark, of course, on the end of that sentence, but we're talking about the Ugandan elections of January 2021. This is an Institute of Commonwealth Studies event, and I hope we'll bring some elucidation into all this. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I'm Roger Hearing. I'm a former BBC broadcaster. I now work for Bloomberg, but I am hosting this in a personal capacity. And the idea is that we try and find out a bit about what has gone on since the election, what the prospects are, potentially, of challenging the result. As you will know, there have been a lot of events in Uganda in the last few days relating to that. We hope we may be joined by Bobby Wine at some point. We're not absolutely sure that we will be. If we do, I may have to interrupt whoever's speaking at the time. But without more ado, why don't we start by talking to Orion Nyeko, who's Human Rights Watch Africa Division, Uganda and Tanzania researcher, who joins us. Orion, thanks for being with us today. Let me ask you then, first of all, just give us a sense of what has happened since the election, particularly in terms of human rights and particularly in terms of attempts to challenge the result. Just bring us up to speed, if you would.
Well, thank you so much. I think in order to talk about what has happened since the elections took place, it's important to put into context what actually took place around the elections, because a lot of the things that have been happening are connected to the different abuses that took place. And so to briefly describe the 2021 elections, they were extremely violent and involving the security forces. And much of it took place in the context of the abuse of COVID as an excuse by authorities to repress people. So there were killings took place in November during protests. Opposition members and journalists have been beaten and arrested. Rallies during the election season were dispersed violently, and the internet was shut down. Since the took place, if you recall, the internet was shut down during 5 days just prior to the elections and several days after they took place. And social media access was also restricted for some time and only restored in February. Facebook continued in Uganda. We saw Robert Chagulanyi, who was the main contender against Museveni, the incumbent, being subjected to an 11-day house arrest immediately after the elections up until a court was made to order the security. We've also seen prior to the election, so during election season and after, numerous reports of people being disappeared. Witnesses and family members of people across the country have reported that their loved ones have been picked up by men, in some cases, who have been brandishing guns and bundled into vans, never to be heard from again. It's been something that has been reported numerous times in the media, and to which the government has been tasked to respond. The Interior, the these disappearances, telling Parliament that at least 44 people have been reported as missing, but that the government has only been able to confirm and respond to only 13 cases. This is something that has been central to discussions about what has been taking place, what took place during and after the elections. We've also seen the authorities beat journalists who are covering delivering a petition to the UN Human Rights Office, where
Orion, if I may interrupt you just for a second, we're having, I think a lot of people are finding, I'm afraid your internet signal is clearly coming and going. We've made up quite a bit of what you've had to say. I wonder if I can ask you to turn off your video, just so we can conserve bandwidth and see if that might help with us being able to hear you. But Orion, let me pick up on a couple of things you were saying there. You're talking about the ways in which, if people couldn't hear, there's been a lot of intimidation since the election. I think people have been aware, perhaps, in the last couple of days of attacks that seem to have been on journalists outside Bobi Wine's house and in the areas perhaps to do with where the petition is or is not being withdrawn. It's a bit unclear on that. Hopefully we'll hear from Bobi Wine quite shortly on that. But Orion, is there a sense, do you think, that this violence or intimidation is getting worse?
I think that the violence that has happened it's difficult to characterize as getting worse. I think it reflects ongoing repression that has taken place in Uganda for a very long time. Historically, these kinds of things have escalated during the election season, but they're not new. And I think that's important to point out because I think there's a tendency that people have to only pay attention to these things during these seminal events like elections or particularly or court cases and so on. But violence against journalists, restrictions against opposition have been characteristic of Uganda for quite a long time and will likely continue to be as well. And it's important to continuously pay attention to these abuses and the need for them to be addressed and for perpetrators to be held accountable on the long term.
Okay, Orion, that's the picture in terms of the pressure. But what about what's actually happening? I mean, there have been some confused reports. Bobby may well be up shortly, hopefully, to speak for himself. But is it your understanding that the petition is being withdrawn, has been withdrawn? What are the complications of that?
Well, yeah, the reports that we've seen is likely the same that you've seen. Is that Bobi Wine intended to withdraw his application to the court, and it's my understanding is that it was a matter of him fulfilling that. He'd expressed that he intended to do that. So I guess, yeah, as you said, he would probably be the best person to speak to his intentions around that.
Well, hopefully we will hear from him shortly. And what about the position more widely in the country? I mean, do you understand that similar intimidation is going on outside Kampala or across the country?
I mean, I think during the campaign season, we saw repression across the board in different parts of the country, particularly during opposition rallies, where in several instances that we documented and others have documented as well, where the security forces dispersed rallies extremely violently. So it's not characteristic just to Kampala, but these things have happened across across different parts of the country. And I think at this point in time, what we're hearing, the reports that we're hearing about disappearances have also been reported to be taking place in different parts of the country, not just in Kampala. Yeah, so I would say it's been fairly diverse.
Is the opposition able to organise? Are they able to get past this, or has it been effectively a closing down of political action?
Well, I think the opposition is able to exist. We have an opposition, but the space in which it exists is increasingly restricted and constricted by the different tactics that the government has taken to prevent them from doing the work that they're supposed to do. I mean, we, at the head of this discussion, we talked about the closing space for the media and the ways in which the media can cover opposition rallies or host opposition members. We've seen that be extremely restricted, not only during the campaign season, but prior to that. I think that the space for the opposition is extremely difficult and deliberately so.
Orion, thanks very much indeed. I should add, by the way, to anyone listening, we will have question and answers at the end of this first part of the session, which you'll be able to submit in the chat function, and my colleague Sue will present those, and I'll put them to out there so that we can talk about them. Let me come now, if I may, to Jude. Jude Bayamukama, who's a managing partner of JB Bayamukama and co-advocates in Kampala. Jude, thanks for being with us today. We were hearing there from Orion about some of the problems to do with intimidation. I think a lot of people are interested in the fact that to what extent the rule of law continues. Rule of law or rule by law, I suppose is one way of putting it. Can you give us a sense of the legal situation at the moment and how far the rule of law does apply?
Thank you, Roger. We have a very interesting legal landscape in Uganda.
Jude, sorry to interrupt you at the start. If I could just ask you to switch off your camera as well, because like Orion, we may then be able to hear you better. So Jude, could you switch off your camera?
Okay, it's done.
It is a little better, yes. Let's try with that.
Can you hear me better? All right. I was saying we have a very interesting legal landscape in this country. On one hand, we have a whole body of laws. We have a constitution that's fairly progressive. A Bill of Rights, Chapter 4 is a very elaborate Bill of Rights. Our constitution has very wonderful provisions that govern the conduct of elections, both at the presidential level, at the parliament level, and at the lower local government levels. All that we have got a judiciary that is very we have a constitutional court, we have a high court, and all that. We have a parliament where debate is robust, and all those sorts of institutions. So on the first, you would say that we have a functional democracy in Uganda. But here is the problem. Many of those institutions really think to dupe the public and people who are not willing to discern and really exist to perform the duty that they are called to perform. I will start with our constitution, for instance. We have a Bill of Rights. It clearly provides rights that individuals have who are arrested. We have our constitution requires, for instance, that if a person is arrested, they should be produced before a court of law, not less than 48 hours. But as I speak now, I think that provision of the constitution is violated almost on a daily basis by the security organs that detain people. It's almost miraculous when an individual is detained and charged before a court of law within 48 hours. It's a constitutional provision that is more honored in the breach since 1995, when this constitution was first promulgated. Now, when we come to the legal landscape in terms of elections, it's even a more worrying situation. In terms of the electoral legal framework, the laws that we have that govern conduct of elections, again, on paper, we have a very good legal framework. But when it comes to implementation, it's simply another thing altogether. We have laws that govern how presidential elections are supposed to be conducted. The Presidential Elections Act of 2005. That law requires that any person who is intending to stand for is free to carry out public consultations almost a year before elections are held. What happens instead is that individuals such as Bobby Wine and were completely blocked by security organs. They were not even allowed to carry out any meaningful public consultations for the entire 2019 and part 2020. They were unable to engage with the members of the public about the presidential ambitions. Yet the law clearly says they have that right. In fact, the Supreme Court of this country in 2016, in a presidential election petition between the former Prime Minister, who was a confidant of the incumbent president, the Honorable John Patrick Amama Mbabazi, versus Yoweri Museveni and the Electoral Commission, the Supreme Court of this country clearly ruled that it is unlawful for security agents to block intending presidential aspirants from consulting the public and holding meetings before they launch their bid for the presidency. It's in a judgment of the Supreme Court, but it's been ignored like it doesn't exist. And yet, for those of you who are in the international community who may not have opportunity to know what exactly happens, you'll see this institution. The judgments of our Supreme Court, I'm sure, are available online. You can get them. But frankly, they never change much. We have had 3 presidential petitions since 2001. There was a presidential election petition in 2001. There was another in 2006. There was another in 2016. And then this one, which Bobby Wine has decided to withdraw, is supposed to be the 4th presidential election petition since the NRM, since President Museveni came to power in 19 and then promulgated the 1995 Constitution. In each of those, the past 3 presidential election petitions, the Supreme Court judges unanimously agreed that there is a huge problem with security organs should stop interfering with the conduct of political processes in this country. In particular, their continued harassment of political opponents of the ruling government. It is documented in the judgment, in 3 judgments of the Supreme Court. But has that changed the conduct of elections in this country or the behavior of security? Not at all. On the contrary, it seems to me that with every passing presidential electoral cycle, the security organs are emboldened to get away with so much.
Jude, if I can interrupt
in 2010,
Jude, if I can interrupt for just a second.
Yes, please.
I'll just say, by the way, that unfortunately our colleague Orion Nyeko has had to withdraw. He's not feeling well, so he won't be part of the discussion. But it was good that we were able to hear from him earlier. But Jude, what I wanted to pick up with you was, you're talking about the rule of law. To what extent is the judiciary independent? Is it really possible to say whether judges are able to make independent decisions or not?
No. Right, consider our judiciary. They have independence on 2 levels. First of all, the manner in which the judiciary is appointed, we have got a body in the Constitution called the Judicial Service Commission, which is in charge of recommending persons for appointment to the president of the country. However, the Judicial Service Commission is constituted by the president, or the chairperson and members of the Judicial Service Commission are directly appointed by the president. And those are the people in charge of identifying and vetting individuals to be appointed judges of the High Court, Court of Appeal, and Court. And they also appoint all the lower level of judicial officers. So already at that level, the incumbent president has got very tight control over who can become a judicial officer. That is one. Secondly, in terms of respect for judicial security organs in this country, and even not just security organs, but the government generally, they pick and choose which decisions of the courts of law they are respect. As we speak right now, we have got 2 decisions of the Court of Appeal of this country, which clearly indicated that the court martial, that is military, which are designed to try errant soldiers and the people and members of the armed forces, should never attempt to try civilians because they are not independent under the Constitution. We have 2 decisions of the Court of Appeal specifically prohibiting military tribunals, or the court martial as we call it in this country, from trying civilians. But they have disregarded with impunity. As we speak right now, there are over 40, most of them who are supporters or agents, candidate Bobby Wine, who are being tried in the midst, despite a decision of the Civilian Court of Appeal, which is the superior court, stopping those trials, pronouncing itself that those trials are illegal. So again, that is another area. Then we have hundreds of decisions which are delivered against the government of Uganda, but they are never official decisions which award damages against the government. We have hundreds of human rights cases of people whose rights are violated, and they take the government to courts of law, and the courts of law award damages. Many of them never get to be paid that money, or if they are paid, it takes not less than 10 years. Some of them pursue that money in debt. So it renders the whole process a mockery. And then lastly,
let me ask you then, what you're saying is that there is a system, the system just isn't being worked properly and is in some cases being abused, is that right?
Absolutely. The system is not being worked to the letter. The system, the law books, what the law provides, what is in the what's in the Constitution is not the problem. The problem is we have a culture from the executive.
Right. And I mean, Jude, let me ask you then, what about the arms of the state? We talked about the judiciary, but what about the military? What about the police? Do they effectively work within the law or not?
When it comes to the security organs generally, whether the police or the army, frankly, they are among some of the violators of the law. In fact, our own body, we have got a government body called the Uganda Human Rights Commission, which is established under the Constitution. It renders reports every year pointing out that the leading violators of human rights in this country are the police and army. What the problem really is that the security organs are above the law. They get away with so much. They cannot be taken to courts of law. When you do take them to courts of law, they pick and choose which decisions they are going to obey and which ones they are going to disregard.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Jude. Good to have you with us. I mean, your sound came and went, but I think we probably heard a good deal, and which is great. I mean, obviously the technical issues are still very apparent, but thanks for being with us, and stay with us if you can. Let me now bring in Sue Onslow, who is Dr. Sue Onslow, Senior Research Fellow, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, who's helped organise this, of course. But Sue, you've been keeping an eye on what's going on in terms of the media, specifically in Uganda, during this whole period of the election and post-election. Just give us a sense of what you found.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Roger, and my thanks to everyone who's logged on. As people will know, I've been working at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies on challenges to media freedom across the Commonwealth, and we've been running a website since 2017, which has basically tracked issues around media freedom, and it's very evident that Uganda is, shall we say, one of the stories in terms of the progressive diminution of respect for freedom of expression, respect for freedom of media, and in fact, the World Index, the Index on World Freedom has seen Uganda decline 23 places down to, I think, position 135 now. And as Orion had underlined, it's very clear that in terms of the media space in Uganda, and it was particularly important during the election because of the COVID restrictions, which led the government to ban rallies, mass rallies, officially, meant that the role of the media space was really highlighted in terms of legislative campaigning, but particularly the presidential campaigning. I went back to the last time that the Commonwealth was able to run an election monitoring team in Uganda, which was 2016. They'd run, of course, election monitoring missions in Uganda back in 1980. They picked up again in 2006 and then again in 2011. And it's really very striking that the problems around the media space in Uganda, which was so prevalent and so evident in the 2021 campaign, were clearly highlighted by the COG report of 2016. And also, and I'm just going to point people back to that report. And of course, that mission was led by former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, a leading former military man turned Democrat who spoke with tremendous authority. And that particular report made express recommendations for corrections to the problematic media space in Uganda. So they've already been identified as, should we say, systematic irregularities, a pattern of persistent state pressure in independent media, physical attacks on journalists, covering opposition rallies, arrests on journalists, interruption of broadcasts, mass suspension of reporters, the video footage of soldiers abducting civilians, deaths and injuries to unarmed civilians, breaking up rallies, taking over the administration of polling stations, have filled social media, and also images of journalists being attacked and beaten for covering Bobi Wine's petition, as you made reference to at the start, to the Supreme Court. There have been media reports since the restoration of the internet have shown ballot rigging, ballot box stuffing, previously marked ballots, insecure ballot boxes, and inflated voters' roll. But I think it goes beyond this, these systemic irregularities, which have, should we say, a very troubling historical narrative there. It's not simply that it's the state, but it's also the sites of power of the beyond the state. Because I think in the Ugandan context, and I'd be very interested to hear what Jude has to say on this, there's a particular interweaving of formal and informal structures and powers and institutions. So even though there is resilience and dedication of journalists who really are doing their best to cover the necessary range, to bring the necessary range, that covering the Ugandan elections was definitely a hard hat area, I think, for journalists, and particularly for those who were covering opposition rallies and opposition attitudes. They have been extremely resourceful and creative in the ways that they had sought to deliver non-government narratives, and critics of the NRM, the government party, their dominant discourse in popular culture, and that there's also reports of two separate software apps that were being developed called Open Vote Africa and YouVote, which had enabled domestic monitors and voters and party officials to transmit unadulterated and unaltered DR forms, the Declaration of Record forms, to secure servers for independent tallying. So in other words, they could try and run an independent parallel vote count. But when I make reference to the structural problems facing media coverage in 2021, in addition to that range of the security forces, persecution and harassment, and restrictive media legislative impediments, there's also, I think, the role of money in Ugandan politics. And it's associated with the demand and supply of media access. Now, according to the Alliance for Campaign Finance Monitoring, and I quote from a report that's just published in 2021, the volumes of money that flow into Ugandan politics is mind-boggling, and it's unclear where it comes from. Now, I just make a comparative point here that in 2016 election, Museveni spent Ugandan shillings 32.64 billion. Now that's in equivalent in US dollars of $8.9 billion. Now this was logged in the Commonwealth Observation Group report. And it was sourced from donations and, quote, other sources. So there's an extraordinary commercialization of politics with vast amounts of money and gifts, cash sums to village cells, livelihood improvements, incentives, food, blankets, radios that were given. In terms of this demand and supply of media access, I think we have to bear in mind that how many candidates there have been in the Ugandan elections. There were 11 presidential candidates, but there was something like 2,000, I believe, parliamentary candidates. And there's a limitation on the amount of time that the 292 radio stations could actually devote to giving impartial coverage. So given that internet penetration of Uganda is less than 50%, is limited penetration of social media platforms, pushing you back onto community radio and radio, which is consumed by 80% of Uganda, the Ugandan population. Now, money plus limited supply, demand. That led to, should we say, owners of radio and television stations revising their advertising rates upwards to, should we say, take advantage of this anticipated demand for political advertising. And because of that, it effectively priced people out of the market. Women aspirants, the Alliance for Campaign Freedom, for Campaign Finance identified, had said that the cost of conventional media platforms had just become too high for them to afford. So there were reported cases of, should we say, media buyout. Now, if you add to that, she's a proprietorial bias, the heavy weighting of government advertising and investment. I was listening to a report on Zimbabwe media yesterday, and it was commented that although private media in Zimbabwe is being battered, and I would expect the same to be happening in Uganda, that, let's face it, state-sponsored, state-supported media is never going to fail. So you've got a combination of commercial and editorial interest and very deep state pockets. There's also the aspect of self-censorship that definitely kicked in the 2021 campaign. Afrobarometer picked up in December of 2020 that there had been a sharp shift that month to event reporting rather than analysis in the Ugandan media based on in-depth commentaries with eyewitness accounts. And that was directly reflective of a pullback on covering opposition narratives, because of course it wasn't simply Bobi Wine and the NUP. Then there was also the question that in the Ugandan media space, there's also, of course, the influence of the commercial model of stories that sell. There's the question of training. There's little incentive for the state to invest resources in journalistic schools that encourage investigative reporting. And you've also got the important aspect of state control of broadcasting and licensing. When you add on top of that, that there's political bias in the Ugandan Media Council and the Ugandan Communications Commission, and that there has not been impartial application of the Electoral Commission of the protocols embedded in best electoral practice, this was altogether a skewed media environment for impartial political campaigning.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Sue. Very comprehensive review, really, of what's been going on there. Can I pick up one point before we go to Q&A with Jude? Sue was mentioning, Jude, a lot about the way that money seems to influence a lot of what goes on, particularly in the media space. Is that a bigger problem in the country, in the sense of big money essentially still effectively supporting the incumbent in most areas, and that making it very hard for the rule of law and also for democracy to come through? Jude? Do we still have Jude on the line? I think we may have lost Jude.
I think we may have lost Jude.
So we'll be able to bounce that off. We were slightly having trouble, of course, earlier with his internet connection. I think it may have unfortunately failed. But it is an interesting question. If I just pick that one up with you, Sue, just to say, money does seem to be a big issue. Is it possible to perceive that that is a big part of the problem?
I think it is. I think it is part of the problem. I also think that the trouble is around campaign financing, although there are written protocols, is that there is a degree of opacity. There is a lack of transparency. There's also a resistance to particular donors declaring their interests, but from a desire not to wish to compromise a future political position. I was looking at the sources of identified funding, and I was struck by the extent to which the NRM is able to take advantage of that question of incumbency. That there is a practice of 20% of MRM MPs were expected to donate 20% of their salary, basically, to future party disbursement. Then there is, of course, the access to state resources. Then, of course, there is the aspect of donors and general benefactors, and the ability to take advantage of, should we say, contracts and entrepreneurism in the Ugandan political system. So there are all sorts of factors and impediments that are going to militate against honest submission and financial accounting. Although, yes, there are protocols for exactly that.
Let me bring in Philip Murphy. I think Philip wants to talk. Philip, can I bring you in?
I was going to put this point to Jude, but there's a huge amount of expertise in this virtual room, and it might be a way of broadening out the discussion really to some matters of principle. Clearly, there is a Commonwealth Charter of values. There is a Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. But the Ministerial Action Group only seems to operate in extremis. We have a case here where this was clearly going to be a flawed process. And indeed, in quite an unusual move, on the eve of the election, the Commonwealth Secretary General, Patricia Scotland, made a public statement in which she said, I've conveyed to the leadership of Uganda, the Commonwealth family's deep concern about reports of constraints on freedom of assembly, intimidation, violence, and election-related deaths in the country. So really opening up what one hoped was diplomacy behind the scene. What should the Commonwealth be doing in these situations of deeply flawed elections, given that it hasn't on this occasion sent an election observer mission? What should it have been doing more than it was in the run-up to these elections? What should it be doing now that President Museveni has been returned to office? I'd be very interested to know people's views on this. Thank you.
Would anyone like to come in on that?
If I may, Philip, I think it's particularly striking, particularly because of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group's enhanced remit in 2011, which had expressly sought to, should we say, position oversight and assistance for reform. I also think that we need to bear in mind that the current chair of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group is indeed Kenya, the vice chair is Australia, and of course the UK, as current chair in office, is also a member. And the future chair in office, of course, will be Rwanda. And I, as a researcher, there are questions in my mind about whether there can be, should we say, a proactive process in CMAG, given the particular political complexion of CMAG going forward after June of 2021.
Well, can I ask a question of either or both of you? To what extent can CMAG be involved if there is no willingness from the Ugandan side to allow it to? I mean, isn't there a basic problem there, which the Commonwealth has often faced, of how you deal with one of the members who is not willing to go along with whatever interventions you might intend to make? Philip, do you have a view on that?
I'd just be
Can I bring you back in?
to hear some other voices in the room. I think it's actually very difficult in the way that the organisation is structured.
Yeah, I mean, it presumably is almost impossible in many ways. I mean, is there a structure within the Commonwealth? Should there be a structure that allows it to deal with people, with members who will not work along with it? Not perhaps along the old Zimbabwe model, which never went particularly well. But what do you think, Sue?
I'm just reading a comment from Mark Robinson, who, of course, was on, I believe, Mark, you were on the Commonwealth Observation Mission to Uganda in 1980. You were certainly on the 1980 Zimbabwe first Commonwealth Observation Mission. As far as...
Sorry, no, I wasn't. I was the backup person in Sonny Ramphal's office in Marlborough House on that particular occasion.
Oh, were you? Oh,
but I was an election observer in two where have we got? Of the last 3 elections, I was the election observer in 2010, and then, or was it 2005, and then 2015, because they wanted somebody who'd been on previous elections to say how much influence recommendations of the Commonwealth Observer Group had, and the answer has always been a very emphatic none.
Mm. Well, Mark, in that situation, it's interesting to pick up with you, Mark, on that. What do you think could change for the better? What might be possible to do? What mechanism could improve that?
Well, I think the only mechanism that could improve it, but there's great reluctance in that mechanism, is CMAG. And I mean, I think we came away in the previous election all thinking that what is the point of the Commonwealth observing elections if they know that their recommendations have not even had any kind of impact, but from one election to another. But of course, CMAG's, it's not a Zimbabwe situation. I don't think the Zimbabwe situation at the time was as brilliantly handled as it could have been. But CMAG does have the potential to exercise leverage and put enormous pressure. I think where we've got real concern here now is that Museveni just, the moment the election is over, puts tremendous pressure on the leader of the opposition, won't let him leave his house or whatever it happens to be. It happened to Bessigine, I believe, though I haven't read any reports, but I believe it's happened this time as well.
Well, we understand that is the case. In fact, we've been trying to get in touch with Bobby Wine, who was supposed to be on this call, but I think communications are not working with him at the moment. Of course, he has been under a form of house arrest, I think, for quite a while on all this.
Yes, I think he has.
I think, Sue, let me come back to you on this one and ask, I mean, is there an appetite, do you think, inside the Commonwealth to change things in this sort of way, to make things any more potentially effective? Or is the organisation at a point now where that's not going to happen?
Well, first a point which has to, of course, to be remembered is that the Commonwealth operates by consensus rather than by majority vote. But as you point out to the point about is there an appetite, I would say yes, there is. But it depends, of course, where that appetite sits. If you were to speak to the former Liberal Liberal Party politician, Foreign Minister, and of course Australian High Commissioner Alexander Downer, he is emphatic that in the latter part of the 1990s and the 2000s that CMAG really did have teeth and it was an effective discussion body, and that it crafted shall we say, appropriate responses, and it showed political will and political leadership. And that's why I made reference to the importance of the particular chair, the importance of whoever are members of CMAG. CMAG is going to have another meeting. I believe it's scheduled for April of this year. Their last meeting was in October of last year. And so there's one coming up. CMAG has a process of private discussions and issues of other matters can come up under any other business, and the Commonwealth prides itself on its discrete discussions. But in instances like this, where Commonwealth civil society organisations are certainly pressing for the Commonwealth to stand by its declared values, it needs to be seen to be putting its money where its mouth is, quite literally. But this is deeply problematic.
Okay, let me bring Philip in on that. I think Philip wants to make a comment.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I mean, when you came back to me before, it sort of slightly took me by surprise. I just having to have a little bit of time to think about it. I mean, it strikes me that we've seen in recent years, and certainly since I've been at the Institute, the difficulty of drawing a line insofar as breaches of Commonwealth values are concerned. And we saw that in 2013 around the heads of government meeting in Sri Lanka. And it is an inherent problem with the intergovernmental Commonwealth. But I mean, I wonder whether we need to think more broadly about the Commonwealth. And I think this is something that we've been coming back to in discussions about, particularly about media freedom. That Commonwealth governments in many of these areas are part of the problem. And the intergovernmental Commonwealth is not the beginning and the end of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a series of networks. And actually, perhaps the most effective thing that we can do, using this kind of new technologies, where we can link with activists, grassroots activists around the world, not always particularly effectively or perfectly, but we, we can actually buttress civil society groups who are doing the heavy lifting on this, not waiting for CMAG or the Secretary General to respond. And I think that this is actually one of the strengths of the Commonwealth. Again, I think that the Secretariat is not a very powerful organization because it was really never given that power. But the Commonwealth is really bound together as much by a sense of historical obligations to one another, as it is by the fact of occasional ministerial meetings and things like CMAC. And so that what we need to do is to use these technologies and develop these networks to provide means of expressing solidarity, ongoing solidarity, not just around the period of the elections themselves, but 365 days a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought about the way these networks might work. But in this particular case, Philip, can you see a practical way? I mean, we've had amply demonstrated the technical difficulties of keeping in touch, but is there a way in which, what sort of groups do you think would be effective in this situation in trying to help things along the lines you've been talking about?
I think we can publicize, abuses of human rights, not just straightforward abuses of human rights, but the kinds of niggling restrictions on freedom of expression, which enable repressive regimes to cling on to power. And again, I think this is the useful thing about the Commonwealth network. That often in countries that are certainly not in the news. I mean, most national news organisations are pretty parochial. I don't think the British are much worse than anyone else in this respect. But we keep up the pressure. We keep monitoring the situation across the 53 member states of the Commonwealth, however large or small they may be, and actually, provide some extra leverage, some external leverage for human rights activists and civil society activists of various sorts. And again, on questions that the intergovernmental Commonwealth are reluctant to take up.
Yeah, it's I guess a frustration in a way that what works perhaps at the lower levels, I mean, I use that term advisedly, is not necessarily reflected in the higher corridors of power, perhaps. I mean, Sue, you were talking about the media aspect of all this. Is there a way in which, in the media zone, that can work better? The kind of thing Philip's talking about is the ways of trying to influence things on the ground.
Trying to influence things on the ground. Now, this is where I'm going to defer to the work being done by my colleague, David Page, and Rita Payne, who I know are on this call, who are members of the Commonwealth Journalists Association.
Shall I bring Rita, if you're on, perhaps shall I bring Rita in?
Well, one moment, just to say that I think in terms of on the ground, that there are certainly those networks of support, and it's very important that there should be external lobbying. And this is where particularly I think the role of the Ugandan diaspora, because too often it's thought of the inside Uganda and outside Uganda of the Western, but I think it's the importance of the role of the diaspora and their energy and their input and to support democratization and genuinely and a better Uganda. But in terms of the work that David and Rita have been doing, and I've been collaborating with them in trying to give the Commonwealth, should we say, consideration of benchmarks by which to measure when there has been a diminution of freedom of expression and a corralling of media freedom. Because as Rita has always underlined to me, and so has David, so media freedom is the canary in the gold mine as well. And when it starts to being threatened, that is an indication of an increasingly repressive political environment. David, can I hand over to you to talk about the media freedom principles and where they've got to so far?
Yeah,
because I think it is...
David in. David, I suppose exactly that idea of the worthwhileness of a Commonwealth Declaration of Media Principles. Does it have a worthwhileness, if one could put it that way?
Well, we believe it has, yes. We believe that if the Commonwealth can be persuaded to adopt a series of principles, which are themselves, if you like, based on existing Commonwealth countries' commitments in the Charter, in their commitments to the Latham House principles, in their international commitments at the UN, for example, on safety of journalists. It would be one way of codifying what Commonwealth countries have committed themselves to, and it would then make it easier, I think, for them to be held to account by the Commonwealth as an organization. So that is, I think, one reason why we believe the principles would be valuable. Of course,
I suppose that the problem there is the extent to which there could even be a common declaration of these principles. Would there be a willingness to sign up, do you think, throughout the Commonwealth to them?
Well, I think we are beginning to get some traction on this. At a recent meeting of the Commonwealth senior legal officials, it's been agreed that an expert working group should be set up to look at the principles and to hear what Commonwealth countries have to say about them, with a view to, if you like, refining what's been developed by the 6 Commonwealth organizations that have drawn them up. I mean, we've never, taken the view that they are, set in stone, and obviously we want to develop a sense of ownership amongst Commonwealth countries. So it's been encouraging, I think, recently that, the Commonwealth legal officials have agreed to begin that process. Taken a long time, but it's an important first step on the road, I think. Of course, once they have been accepted, if they are accepted, then you would have the issue of how, Commonwealth countries are held to account. And there again, I think we come back to civil society and its role. One other point I just make, which is, I think, of value in South Asia, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and I know that Sneh Aurora is on the call. They have been proactive in setting up something called SAMDEN, which is the South Asia Media Defenders Network, which, if you like, brings together journalists, editors, and also human rights defenders from across South Asia. The idea being to develop a regional network, which can be a voice from the region, which will actually begin to apply pressure to particular regional countries. So that's actually being, I think, a very interesting model, and it's having some traction in South Asia.
Yeah.
And I think we're all watching that with great interest.
Okay, I mean, let me pick up on the idea of a common set of principles, because we had a question in from Simon who says, are there any minimum values that each Commonwealth member must uphold? And if so, what are those values? And there's a second question, is there a red line that must not be crossed, and how really can it be enforced, penalties meted out to the violators of those values? I mean, I think that picks up, I think, in some way, the idea of you can have media principles, perhaps you can have common principles on many other things. I mean, let me come back to Philip on that. Do you think that is something that Commonwealth could approach or not? The idea of a common set of potentially enforceable values?
It's a difficult thing to do. I mean, I suppose only really relatively late in the long history of the development of the Commonwealth has there been a kind of an explicit notion of a set of Commonwealth values. You could say it was sort of implicit in South Africa leaving the Commonwealth in 1961, effectively being forced out because of apartheid. But the Commonwealth, Uganda, in fact, I mean, the Commonwealth struggled with the issue of having Idi Amin's Uganda within the Commonwealth in the 1970s. And it's only at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s that you have this notion of, particularly with the Harare Declaration of 1991, of a common set of principles rather than a kind of common historical heritage. And then...
Amra, why are you telling her? You mustn't speak like that.
Wait. Sorry.
You mustn't speak like that to people.
I think we have some. Could someone mute their recording? Arif, could you mute yours for a second? Sorry, carry on.
No, I mean, and then rather quickly, the Ministerial Action Group convened in 95 to try and enforce those principles, but it hasn't been terribly successful, partly because governments can, as Zimbabwe did, simply withdraw. And yet, in a sense, when a country withdraws, as with South African withdrawal in 1961, it almost makes it all the more important that the rest of the Commonwealth support activists within that country. As I say, I think that the real bond is not shared principles, but a kind of common historical obligation, which we still feel towards Zimbabwe and activists. So that I think is why probably, this, links at a civil society level, which can survive the withdrawal of a government from the intergovernmental Commonwealth, are probably more important than anything CMAG might do. But that's my view. Sue, I think, wants to.
Sorry, it just shows how challenged I am with tech, that I have to raise my hand like that rather than the fancy little yellow hand in the corner. Just picking up on Philip's point about the evolution of should we say, declared Commonwealth values that we've seen with the creation of CMAG and then the expansion of CMAG's remit, so 1995 and then 2011, and the importance of civil society and what can the Commonwealth do as far as Uganda is concerned. I think that there has to be a multi-pronged approach. The Commonwealth, as Mark Robinson has reminded me before now, that it is highly unusual as an international organization that it does have the sanction for suspension or ejection. That the United Nations does not have that. So whether or not there is the necessary political will to formally suspend Uganda, which is a powerful African nation, that remains to be seen. But individual Commonwealth countries, of course, in collaboration with others, certainly had the latitude to not just to make declarations of condemnation of the disgraceful and appalling violence that's been meted out, but then to actually institute more effective sanctions. But that is, of course, confronting the Americans at the moment, of how do you target a bully if they're simply going to ignore you? That was evident in December of 2020 when Senator Engel made that presentation to the Senate and named two particularly oppressive members of the Ugandan security forces, and Museveni simply replaced them. So it's no good going for targeted individuals simply if they are replaced and then that's removed. So there needs to be a much more carefully coordinated, should we say, policy of sanctions if it's considered all bar humanitarian sanctions. But then that comes back to the position that Museveni has been very astute in exploiting, which is, of course, Uganda's contribution to the war on terror and security and securitization in East Africa, and Uganda's contribution to AMISOM, particularly in Somalia and elsewhere. So, and of course, Uganda continues to fight a war against terror in certain groups. Yeah. So, and also then there's the aspect of Uganda has abided by, it could be said, donor economic liberalization packages. So there's an investment from the IFIs also in the Ugandan model of economic development. It is complicated, without a doubt. But I think it does, that there are multi-pronged approaches that are possible at different levels by different actors, but it does require coordination.
And I suppose one of the bigger issues in that is when you're talking about pressure, as you say, Uganda very much involved in the war on terror, which means that, for example, the United States has a much more difficult time in criticizing. And we saw, I think, just today, Museveni's response to potential US sanctions, raising issues, of course, about the handling of the US's own election, which is another issue altogether. But an interesting question coming from Steve Packer, saying, I understand the Commonwealth focus, but the strongest voices post-election in Uganda have been the EU and the US. Where does most international traction lie? The UN from within Africa? I suppose it is a point that the African Union is perhaps in a better position in some ways than the Commonwealth to deal with this. I'll put that out there. I mean, Philip, would you concur?
Well, I don't know about the African Union, but you've seen, regional organisations taking a far stronger line than the Commonwealth has been able to do. I mean, if you look at the Commonwealth election monitoring reports on the Gambia over a number of different elections, I mean, clearly the Gambia was at the extreme of what was considered tolerable. I mean, they tended to get a kind of D- grade from Commonwealth election monitoring groups, but were allowed to continue within the organisation. And eventually it was ECOWAS, which with a degree of ruthlessness that the Commonwealth would not have been appropriate for the Commonwealth to act in that way. But they solved the problem of a regional member that had effectively gone rogue. Had the Commonwealth done anything like that, it would have been accused of the worst sort of neocolonialism. But it is something that an African regional organisation was able to carry out. Mark, do you want to? Mark's got his hand up.
Mark, do you want to have a word?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I mean, it's worth bearing out. The only time that the Commonwealth really intervenes and suspends is in the event of a military coup. I mean, if Myanmar were in my son's working in Myanmar at this very moment, but if Myanmar was in the Commonwealth, it would certainly be suspended after the events of the last few days. When it comes to an election observance, there is always a close relationship between the Commonwealth observers, the EU observers, the African
Cole's current strategic plan. There were.
Sorry, bear one, Mark. Sorry, could you mute yourself? Thank you.
Shall I plow on? Yes. Observers do work closely together, but no Commonwealth country has ever been, apart from Zimbabwe, I think. But then it left before it could be wrapped over the knuckles, and that is part of the problem. We're not helped by the UN, which of course never suspends members. Never. Once you're a member of the UN, you're always a member of the UN. And the only time you change, as happened with, of course, Taiwan and China, it was not one being kicked out and the other coming in. It was simply a recognition of a different set of credentials. I know that because I was in the UN Secretary General's office at the time.
You know it well. Let me bring up one other issue, which I think is interesting and relates in a way, because Myanmar, one of the interesting things there is the extent of the diaspora, the pressure that they are bringing from outside, and there is that sense also, I think, with Uganda. Now, Ronald, you're on the line, I think. Ronald, would you like to ask about the diaspora? I think there is a point you want to make, Ronald.
Yes,
please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, it is the role of the diaspora. I just wanted to emphasize that in this opposition struggle in Uganda, the majority, the diaspora has played a very big role. They have, because the opposition, as you know, especially the Bobby Wine, the young man didn't have enough resources to finance a campaign. but the diaspora actually played a big role in financing that. They also played a big role in giving ideas as to how to work in a hostile environment. So the diaspora, I think, can play a big part because they are quite organized. I mean, here, I know about the Zimbabwe diaspora here, but I also know about the Uganda diaspora in the UK. Very organized, and actually the government in Uganda knows about that. They knows the strength of the diaspora. So in terms of what the Commonwealth can do, the Commonwealth could include the diaspora in, especially the suggestion from Sue about the civil society or non-governmental organizations to actually help in this struggle where you have, an authoritarian government like the one that we have in Uganda.
Well, Ronald, let me ask you, what is it specifically that the Commonwealth could do to help that? I mean, you say they could get involved, but in what sort of way?
Well, the Commonwealth can actually, a lot of the diaspora are actually working from starting off emotionally when they are doing this work. But these kind of forums, the Commonwealth could organize forums where they could help them be a bit more equipped with, technical know-how in terms of how they could address issues of governmental issues, governmental violations, issues of human rights. A lot of the migrant community, which forms the diaspora, may not actually be conversant with that, but the Commonwealth could help with that, could help, put, because it has resources of expertise, skills, and so on, which the diaspora could benefit from.
Isn't there another issue, though, on that, Ronald, which occurs to me that when the diaspora is helping, and I understand about 60% of the finance support for Bobi Wine came from the diaspora, that is seen almost as outside interference as well. It can, in fact, undermine the case of someone like Bobi Wine if it's only outsiders, if you like, who are seen as being the main support base. Do you think that's true, Ronald?
Well, the diaspora, in this case, the community, the Uganda community here, they are Ugandans. And they have a stake in Uganda. They don't only finance people like the opposition, like Bobi Wine, but on a day-to-day basis, they are the ones who pay for the education and health of relatives that are back home. So in a sense, the diaspora is also the welfare state of those countries, of a country like Uganda. So they have a stake, and I think this needs to be legitimized. One of the things that Ugandans have called for is to be able to vote, like Kenyans can vote. But that was suspended. There was a claim that there are no resources. The government said they don't have resources to do that. But actually, legitimation of the diaspora, I think, is important because, and it's not interference with internal matters, because they are Ugandans and they feel and actually are Ugandans.
No, it's an interesting point. Let me come back to Philip on this, just for a sort of Commonwealth view. Could there be a mechanism of the Commonwealth working through diaspora groups, do you think?
It's difficult, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to, I think that whether you like it or not, I mean, London remains the kind of the hub of the Commonwealth, and you know, the sort of centre of its civil society activity, and you know, so diaspora groups, one way or another, play quite an important part in sort of the immediate lobbying of the Commonwealth over particular issues. You saw that happening a lot again over Sri Lanka in sort of 2013. And again, new technologies provide a means of diaspora groups to to keep in touch with those sort of home communities. But again, it's, as I think Sue was pointing out, it's a double-edged sword. If organizations are accused of being are really surviving on external help, it does potentially undermine their legitimacy.
Yeah, it can be a major problem, I think. Let me bring in another issue which Simon has raised on the questions, talking about the reliance.
No, it's quite all right.
Sue's back with us, I think. Yeah. Sue, you there? No?
My apologies, colleagues. I was just trying to get through to Bobby Wine's team, and I'm hoping that he's going to join us.
Right.
So this is me desperately trying to phone while all this is going on. So please, colleagues, please bear with me. I apologise. What were you asking me?
We will. Now, Sue, I'm simply raising the point, which was raised by one of the people involved in the conversation. Simon, I'm talking about the extent of Uganda's involvement in the war on terror in Somalia and places, and how that's a kind of, is there a risk in a way of the West undermining itself perhaps by being as confrontational in a very minor way, perhaps these American sanctions, with Museveni, where he can always throw that back and say, look, I'm an area of stability and support in this region, and that is quite a powerful thing.
It is. That's it. To my mind, that's a very powerful political riposte, and I think that this. Now, what I don't know, of course, is the extent to which that will weigh in the councils of the new administration in Washington. And of course, that you have the comment today that there has been more vocal criticism of the Ugandan elections and their outcome, and there was a pushback from the Ugandan foreign minister who essentially said it's not for America to criticize us, and anyway, you should set your own electoral house in order, which of course was a very effective riposte. But so I think it's going to be part of the careful calculations that are weighed for the incoming administration. Now, sorry, Philip, I know this is a little bit odd. Are you watching to see whether Mr. Robert does indeed join us?
I'm keeping my eyes peeled.
Excellent, thank you. But just
at the moment, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think there's anything in there. Well, let's carry on anyway while we're doing this. Ronald, can I come back to you on that one, because I think it is interesting the extent to which the West and perhaps still some of the dominant powers in the Commonwealth too also are prepared to tolerate situations like the one in Uganda because they are a form of stability at a time when stability, in an area where stability is actually rather lacking. Do you think that's true, Ronald?
The issue of stability, certainly when it comes to Uganda, has been played around with by and dangled by Museveni. The actual person who is causing instability in Uganda is the government. That country could actually stabilize if it wasn't for this very authoritarian and very corrupt system that exists. If you look at what has been going on during the elections, the violence, which could itself be a trigger for more instability, the violence was from security forces. And that's mainly because the security forces, both the police and the army, have become more of a force to maintain the current incumbent in power. So they are less like a national police or a national army, but more of forces to ensure that the incumbent continues in power. And that is a potential source of instability, because over 35 years, people experiencing this, people are actually have had enough. So when people talk about, say if there is a change, would this create instability? I think in the medium and long term, it will create stability as opposed to instability.
That's a very interesting line, Ronald, but I suppose the problem is that a lot of governments, particularly, as I say, in the West, will be looking at the immediate rather than the medium or long term. They're looking at the short term on that. And I mean, it's true, obviously, not just of Uganda, but I mean, potentially of Rwanda as well as another country which is allowed or tolerated, perhaps, in a way that it wouldn't be, because it can be pictured as something that isn't causing problems. Philip, I've noticed you nodding there. So do you feel the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, thinking about the development of these principles, and I'll then bring Mark Robinson in, because I could see he was waving. I mean, you had okay, the 90s, when the Commonwealth defines its principles, is quickly followed by the War on Terror, 2001, when you go back to real sort of old-fashioned, great hard-headed great power politics. And that affects how the Commonwealth deals with Pakistan. Because on one hand, Pakistan is sort of edged out because it doesn't, it doesn't conform to Commonwealth principles. But it's a key player in the War on Terror. And so it brings Pakistan back in, really. And this is, again, sort of thinking of authoritarian states and Rwanda. Of course, Paul Rusesabagina is on trial at the moment, a leading Rwandan dissident. Just as Rwanda is about to assume the post of chair in office of the Commonwealth.
Philip, let me interrupt you for just 1 second, if I may. I think we may have Bobby Wine on. Bobby, Excellent. Are you there? Bobby, can you hear me? Yeah. I think perhaps that isn't happening. Bobby, can you hear me? Bobby Wine?
Oh, wait. Sorry. No. Hello? Yes, David.
Getting on another line. Philip, while we're sorting that out, do you want to continue with what you were saying? So do you think that, Philip, that in these circumstances, there's any way of changing perception about that? He may not be a perfect Democrat, but at least he's not causing us trouble. Attitude that does seem to be out there.
And I think that emerging from such a terrible situation as occurred in Rwanda, someone like Paul Kagame is able to defend a degree of authoritarianism, but is maybe not the appropriate person to be chair in office of an organization that is defining itself in terms of particular principles. And that I suppose is the danger of the Commonwealth, that it's in some cases far from being an organization capable of defending its principles. It becomes almost a reputation laundering organization. It's the prestige of hosting a major Commonwealth summit, of becoming chair in office, is a way for some political leaders. One has seen this in other cases recently, trying to bolster their international reputations. I pass on to Mark, because I know Mark wants to...
I'll bring Mark in at this point. Yeah. Mark, what's your view on that?
Well, let's just start with Museveni. He does play the security card very hard indeed. And not only does he play it internationally, he plays it domestically, because he wins his elections from the support he gets from the rural areas, whereas the urban areas, the opposition is very strong and much better organized. But what worries me about the situation in Rwanda now is that what kind of Chogan we're coming up to, it's very hard to know. I'm not sure that it isn't going to be a virtual one.
Mark, I apologize profusely. Let me bring in Bobby, who I can see is on the line. Bobby,
please do.
Welcome to our event here. Bobby, can you hear us okay?
Hello.
Bobby, hello. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm Roger here.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well, sir. Can you bring us up to date with what's happening regarding your petition and where you are in the process at the moment?
Thank you very much.
We may have...
Yeah, first of all, apologies for my terrible reception.
Please go ahead. We can hear you.
Sure. Thank you very much. We just concluded general elections in Uganda, which were marred by violence, irregularities, and a whole lot of criminality. Unfortunately, all the violence and the irregularities were overseen by the government, by the state. General Museveni has personalized all institutions of state that they work not according to their constitutional mandate, but according to the of the incumbent. We lost a lot of Ugandan very young people to violence. This, in my opinion, and in the opinion of very many Ugandans, has been the most rigged election since independence. However, I must say we are confident. We have confidence in the people of Uganda who came out in millions to express their will and are asking us for guidance moving forward after the rigging of the election. We have guided our people not into violence, but into all legal and non-violent acts that are going to assert their will and to communicate their dissatisfaction with dictatorship.
Bobby, can I ask you what you intend to do now? What's the next part of the process for you?
Well, after petitioning the Supreme Court, but again, the panel of justices on the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, showing outright bias, we opted out of the Supreme Court. And like we said, we are taking this matter to the court of public opinion, to the court of the people of Uganda. We intend to call upon the people of Uganda to engage in civil resistance, but should be strictly non-violent and law-abiding. Our constitution provides for Ugandans asserting their voices and resisting dictatorship using the law and using all activities that are within the law.
But we know that's difficult because you yourself have been restricted in your movements, I know, and there has been a lot of intimidation. Do you think you will be able to carry on doing that civil disobedience?
I and my team have made every effort to show Ugandans that they have the power within themselves. They can only emulate us. The regime in Uganda has made it a habit to arrest me and restrict my movements. And because that is the way it is, we have encouraged you and do what they must do, even when I'm incarcerated, even when I'm blocked. The people of Uganda are many. We are 45 million Ugandans. And if they all embrace the rights that they have are given by God and guaranteed by the Constitution. We believe even when I am under incarceration, the people of Uganda can carry out these activities.
Bobby, what would you like the Commonwealth to do? Is there anything the Commonwealth could usefully do to become involved?
Most definitely. The Commonwealth, first of all, can give us their attention. It has always been our plea to the world, to the outside world, not to turn their attention away from Uganda. Because when the world, when we have the attention of the world, that means that there will be limitation of atrocities, especially the unveiling of violence on the innocent citizens of Uganda. So we continue to request for the attention, but not only that, the world is all together. We are united by the values that we share as humanity, as the Commonwealth. So we continue to call upon all Commonwealth countries to call General Museveni to order, because we are all, members of the global community. There's much more the international community can do. For example, targeted sanctions against human rights abusers. If those sanctions are imposed on those that use or rather misuse the guns to oppress the people and abuse their rights, then they will know that they are in check and they will know that they are accountable. Otherwise, the way things are going in Uganda today, those that have the guns feel that they are completely above national and international law.
Are you saying then you think sanctions from the outside world would be a good thing? Would be a way of putting pressure on?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. We know that Uganda is a country that, for example, depends mainly on the outside world. So if it is isolated, if those that perpetuate human rights abuses are sanctioned, we strongly believe it will call them to order. It needs only to be called to order. Also, it would be good, for example, if Uganda was suspended from the Commonwealth. We know that that would communicate strongly to the world. Remember, Museveni ensured that he does not invite foreign observers to this election. The United States observers were not invited, the European Union observers were not invited, and even the Commonwealth election observers were not invited, because he knew that he was going to carry out all manner of irregularities that are not accepted in the Commonwealth.
You are saying then, to be absolutely specific, you think Uganda should be suspended from the Commonwealth?
I don't only think, I believe Uganda should be suspended from the Commonwealth. If that's not done, then the Commonwealth will be
My love, did you attend the call?
Bobby, let me ask you about your hopes for the future. I mean, do you think there is a reasonable prospect that will succeed in overturning the election results?
Did you attend the call, the Bobby Wine thing?
Come again, please.
Bobby, sorry, I think we got some interference there. I'm just asking, do you have any realistic hopes now of being able to overturn the election result?
In Uganda, there's no realistic hope, because General Museveni controls all institutions, including the courts of law. General Museveni has a firm grip on the judiciary, and that explains the illegal and immoral and contradictory behavior of the justices of the Supreme Court. While the petition is on the table of the judiciary, the judiciary has actually met General Museveni 3 times, and it's also said that they've even met him more times in private. So there, we don't see any realistic hope from the judiciary. However, we know that the international community can assert pressure, and we know that the population can also assert pressure on General Museveni, and their will be respected.
Just to be absolutely clear, many people from the outside, Bobby, will have looked at this and said, well, it may not have been a perfect election, but it wasn't necessarily a wholly fraudulent one. What would you say?
I would say those that don't say it's completely fraudulent did not observe it well. This is an election where I had to carry out my campaign wearing a bulletproof jacket and a ballistic helmet. This is an election in which only in 2 days more than 100 unarmed innocent civilians were massacred by the police and the military. This is an election where the military and the police took over the campaign. The Electoral Commission was not in charge. But even on the day of the election, an entire region did not vote because the military took over, and there was a lot of ballot stuffing covered on camera and carried out by the military and the police. So in every decent opinion, this was a very fraudulent election.
Let me bring, if it's okay with you, Bobby, we have a number of participants in this discussion. Perhaps some of them would like to ask you a question. Let me ask Ronald, would you like to ask Bobby something?
Thank you. Mr. Chagulanyi, thanks very much for all your efforts to democratize our country. My question would be, what would you like the diaspora to do to help in this next steps campaign?
Okay, Bobby, what should the diaspora do?
Thank you very much. The diaspora, first of all, allow me to thank them before I even ask for more. The diaspora has largely sponsored our campaign and kept the proceedings in Uganda in the face of the world, even when the internet was completely shut down during the election. The diaspora can further still exert pressure, especially those that are living in the countries that are supporting Uganda, the United States, those in the European Union, and wherever the Ugandans are. They can protest, first of all, on at the offices that are relevant to Uganda internationally, but also can hold their governments to account. In the United Kingdom, which is so close to Uganda, they can put the leaders there to account and encourage them, in fact, and demand that they hold Uganda to the same values that they have, that they are governed with. We have shared values, but there's no sense in Uganda being governed as a dictatorship while we are in collaboration with democracies. Democracy should not tolerate dictatorship in any way.
Okay, let me bring in Simon, who's been sending messages about sanctions. Simon, would you like to ask Bobby Wine something? Simon, can you unmute?
Yes, Honorable Bobby Wine, thank you so much for the effort you are doing. I am Simon Okrut. I think by my name you can guess where I come from in Uganda. I am based in Canada, so I'm right now participating from Canada. You have withdrawn the petition from the Supreme Court, which in my opinion was a wise decision because I've been following how you couldn't be allowed to put in evidence and the interaction of the Chief Justice with the accused. So that was a wise decision. Now you are appealing the public to participate. What preparation have you made? Because you know how the government responds to any kind of protest, be it peaceful or not. So what preparation have you made?
Okay, Bobby, were you able to hear that? What preparation have you made for asking people to continue civil disobedience? What are you doing? Bobby, you still with us?
He's muted.
Bobby, are you muted?
Yeah.
Unmute.
I'm mute. Thank you. Oh my.
So Bobby, were you able to hear that question?
Yes, I was able to hear the question, and I'll respond to it, please. I'm saying, unfortunately, I may not be at liberty to speak publicly about any preparations, well knowing that we live under a military dictatorship, that as soon as the regime knows of any plans or any arrangements, they will move very fast to thwart it. So just to let you know, to let the world know that we are making arrangements with everybody, but most importantly, communicating it, knowing that many of us might be arrested, many of us might be put in jail, but we want Ugandans to know that not all of us can be arrested or eliminated.
Okay. Let me bring in Philip Murphy from the Commonwealth Institute. Philip, do you have a question for Bobby? Philip, can you unmute?
Yeah. Hi, Bobby. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to see you.
Thank you.
I mean, short of expelling Uganda from the Commonwealth, what can the current Commonwealth Secretary General do? What should she be saying to Museveni at the moment, in your view?
Come again, please ask the question again.
Let me, Bobby, what Philip was saying was, what do you think the Commonwealth Secretary General is doing right now in terms of Uganda? What should she do?
We think the head of the Commonwealth should join the world in demanding for an audit into the recently concluded January 14th election in Uganda. General Museveni should know that he does not just break laws with reckless abandon and get away with it. So we would be glad if the Commonwealth demanded for an audit into that election, and to also demand for an investigation into the human rights abuses and the murders and the abductions that have happened and continue to happen to the present hour.
Let me bring Mark in. Mark, do you have a question for Bobby Wine? Do you want to unmute, Mark?
Yes. Bobby, I've been an election observer in 2 Ugandan elections, and it seemed the Commonwealth reports made some good recommendations about future conduct of elections, which it seems to me have always been ignored. Do you think that the Commonwealth should take a stronger stance in terms of arguing that the recommendations of its observer groups should be not just taken note of, but implemented?
Bobby, did you hear that?
Yeah, I did not hear the last bit of it.
Essentially, it was when they get the recommendations of observers, election observers, do you think the Commonwealth should push for those recommendations to be implemented? Should they have more teeth, in a way?
Yes.
Thank you. It would make a whole lot of sense if the Commonwealth demanded that the recommendations that were proposed are implemented. I must remind the world that even the Supreme Court of Uganda, in the previous election, presidential election petition, proposed recommendation, made some recommendations, and instructed that they are implemented before the next general elections. Unfortunately, the parliament did not implement those reforms, and we went into yet another election short of those recommendations, and that even made it worse this time around. So I believe that much as the Ugandan parliament might not be powerful enough to insist on the recommendations that they make, but I believe that the Commonwealth is powerful enough to insist that those recommendations are implemented. Like I said, Uganda can also be suspended from the Commonwealth. That alone would remind the powers that be in Uganda, that they all to adhere to the same values.
I was on the group that made those recommendations. And by the way, congratulations for the way you have fought your campaign. It's been a lesson to many countries around the Commonwealth.
Mark, thanks for that. Bobby, can I give you a question we've had in on text? George from Bahrain was saying we're concerned about the brain drain. He's a law graduate, failed to get a job, so I didn't know anyone in government. I mean, those kind of frustrations are a big problem for Uganda, aren't they? Did you hear that, Bobby?
Yes, I heard you. Indeed, brain drain is a big challenge, but one would not very easily blame the people, especially the young men and women, the young professionals, the great talents that we lose on a daily. We lose medical doctors in their hundreds, young lawyers in their hundreds, engineers, or even artists and sports people. These people, especially the young professionals, really feel that they are stuck in a world that does not offer the opportunities that they so deserve. So we lose them. We know that we can only cure that if we improve the circumstances back home, if we improve the conditions, if we make it worth their while.
All right. Bobby, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your time, and I know a very difficult time for you, so we really appreciate you being here and being able to talk to us. Can I personally wish you the very best of luck, and please stay safe.
Thank you very much. Stay safe too.
Good to talk to you, sir. Thank you. Bobby Wine there, with us on this event, something we half hoped but didn't necessarily expect, Sue. Down to your efforts, I think, there, Sue.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm sorry about the frantic scurrying that you saw, and my apologies to NUP chapter in Bahrain, which I know had raised its hand. I was passing that message to our chair, but I'm sorry that that yellow hand didn't get noticed. But anyway, my sincere thanks to Mr. Bobby Wine for joining us. And clearly it's been an extremely busy day and he was on the move, but that was a remarkably cogent presentation of what the opponents of the Museveni team feel should be done, that the Commonwealth needs to engage with this, that there should be active consideration, indeed suspension from the Commonwealth, and the important issue of sanctions, which are complicated, and there needs to be a very careful debate about that, but also the role of the diaspora and what the Secretary General can do. My great thanks also to Orion for joining us before he was obliged to withdraw, and also to Mr. Jude, but particularly to you, Roger, for conducting this discussion, and to you, Philip. It's been a privilege, and most of all, I think that we've been joined by a remarkably resilient politician. Remarkably resilient, and I want to give thanks to Mr. Bobby, and also to his wife Barbara, and to his family and his campaign team.
And thank you to you, Sue. That was really exciting. That was we got there in the end. And thank you so much, Roger.
Well, colleagues, thank you for staying with us. I think that is the best.
That's it, I think, pretty much. As moderator, I will wind up the proceedings and say thanks to everyone for getting involved and for getting your questions across, which we had some tremendous questions and perhaps some light on the situation, which is still, of course, extremely difficult. But thanks very much for being with us.
It is indeed. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.